colony, but was ruled under a corporate charter rather than a governor. These charter colonies often granted colonists significantly more political liberty compared to other colonies. A proprietary colony was governed by an individual who was typically the head of a joint stock company. These colonies were distinct from crown colonies in that they were commercial enterprises with responsibilities to shareholders. Proprietary governors typically did not live in the colony, and so appointed local governors and councils to rule in their absence. Over time, however, these proprietary colonies became increasingly difficult to manage and transitioned to crown colonies instead. An important yet often overlooked development in England's overseas expansion is that of the plantation of Ulster, which saw Protestant settlers from Scotland and England transported to parts of the north of Ireland during the early years of King James's reign. This model of organised colonisation would form the blueprint for future English colonial expansion, with many of the leaders of the Ulster plantation later becoming involved in a... If you were to look at Britain on a map today, you'd be forgiven for thinking that its borders only encompass those of the British Isles. But if you look at the world as a whole, you will find that there are actually 14 overseas territories where the British government still holds power. From Gibraltar, at the entrance of the Mediterranean, to the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic, these are the last remaining possessions of Britain's once mighty empire. If you were to look at Britain on a map today, you'd be forgiven for thinking that its borders only encompass those of the British Isles. But if you look at the world as a whole, you will find that there are actually 14 overseas territories where the British government still holds power. From Gibraltar, at the entrance of the Mediterranean, to the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic, these are the last remaining possessions of Britain's once mighty empire. At the height of its territorial control, a little over 100 years ago, the British Empire covered 1/4 of the globe's landmass and ruled almost a third of the world's population. It was the empire on which the sun never set. But how did such a small island nation become the largest and most powerful empire the world has ever seen? This is the history of the British Empire. The foundations of the British Empire were laid long before the state of Britain even formally existed. The dominant power in the British Isles throughout much of its history has been the Kingdom of England. With a well-developed economy and military force to match, England, during the medieval and early modern periods, came to rule over the smaller, independent kingdoms in Wales and parts of Ireland. Although, to the north, the Kingdom of Scotland remained a fiercely proud and independent nation who had bitterly and successfully resisted frequent invasions from its powerful southern neighbour. By the early 17th century, Elizabeth I of England had issued several trading and exploration commissions to English adventurers, with the intention of exploring and colonising new territories yet to be claimed by other European powers. The likes of Sir Francis Drake and Sir Martin Frobisher claimed many lands in the name of England, but these were not followed up with settlements. The first English colony, established in North America at Roanoke Island in 1585, failed dramatically, with the colonists mysteriously disappearing, never to be seen or heard from again. Elizabeth also granted several royal charters to joint stock companies, who were established specifically for the purpose of developing overseas trade. Companies such as the Levant Company, founded in 1592, and the East India Company, founded in 1600, were granted monopolies on all English trade to and from these areas. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, the throne of England passed to James VI of Scotland. Upon his ascension to the throne, James became the king of both Scotland and England through the union of the crowns. However, the two kingdoms remained distinct and were ruled separately. As king, James looked to build further on the attempts of his predecessor to establish overseas colonies that were to be ruled and governed under one of the three types of colony structures. A crown colony was directly ruled by the monarch themselves, but would typically be administered by a royally appointed governor and supported by a local council. A charter colony was similar to a crown colony, but was ruled under a corporate charter rather than a governor. These charter colonies often granted colonists significantly more political liberty compared to other colonies. A proprietary colony was governed by an individual who was typically the head of a joint stock company. These colonies were distinct from crown colonies in that they were commercial enterprises with responsibilities to shareholders. Proprietary governors typically did not live in the colony, and so appointed local governors and councils to rule in their absence. Over time, however, these proprietary colonies became increasingly difficult to manage and transitioned to crown colonies instead. An important yet often overlooked development in England's overseas expansion is that of the plantation of Ulster, which saw Protestant settlers from Scotland and England transported to parts of the north of Ireland during the early years of King James's reign. This model of organised colonisation would form the blueprint for future English colonial expansion, with many of the leaders of the Ulster plantation later becoming involved in establishing other colonies in the New World. Throughout the 1600s, the Kingdom of England expanded its overseas colonies in North America and the Caribbean. Some were entirely new ventures, whereas others were annexed from rival foreign powers, like New York, which was seized from the Dutch in 1665. England also significantly developed its trading networks in Africa and the East Indies, with the building of factories and fortified trading posts. A critical component to this mercantile success was the creation of the Royal African Company in 1660, who, over the subsequent decades, would become the leading participant in the brutal yet highly lucrative transatlantic slave trade. During this period, Scotland also began to establish overseas colonies of its own, having looked on somewhat enviously at the successful endeavours of the English. Unfortunately, almost all these attempts ended in failure, with colonies in Nova Scotia, Cape Breton and Carolina barely lasting a few years. The most abject failure of Scotland's colonisation attempts, however, came in 1698, with the Darien Scheme. This aims to establish a colony controlling the overland trade route of the Isthmus of Panama between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. To finance the expedition, an immense amount of capital was raised from the public, which accounted for almost a fifth of the wealth in Scotland at that time. When the ships arrived at the coast of Darien, they named the colony Caledonia and set about constructing a settlement called New Edinburgh. The attempts of the colonists, however, were to ultimately prove futile, as the settlement quickly succumbed to food shortages, tropical disease, and attacks from nearby Spanish forces. Despite a resupply in 1699, the settlement was abandoned, and the survivors, who totaled just a few hundred of the original 2,500, returned to Scotland in disgrace. Due to the total disaster of the Darien Scheme and the loss of public money that had been invested into it, Scotland was plunged into a financial crisis. Many then considered that their best and only chance of being part of a major power would be to share in the benefits of England's colonial enterprise. By the turn of the 18th century, England and Scotland remained independent kingdoms, although the Glorious Revolution of 1688 had dramatically shifted the political landscape within the British Isles. The Catholic James II was deposed and replaced with his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William, who became King William III of England and Scotland. Legislation was passed in England so that only Protestants could inherit the throne, but this law did not apply in Scotland, and so, under the reign of Queen Anne in the early 1700s, efforts were made to unite the parliaments of both nations and secure a Protestant line of succession for the monarchy. When the Acts of Union were passed in 1707, England and Scotland were then united into one kingdom under the name of Great Britain. Over the following decades, Britain became involved in several wars with other European powers, which were fought not only on the continent, but also wherever their overseas colonial interests lay. After the War of the Spanish Succession concluded in 1714 with a victory for Britain and her allies, peace negotiations granted territorial concessions from the defeated French and Spanish, with Newfoundland and Acadia in North America passing into British control, as well as the strategic Mediterranean islands of Gibraltar and Minorca. Meanwhile, the British East India Company, which was not technically part of the empire, but nevertheless still pursued its colonial interests, was engaged in military operations against its French counterpart across the subcontinent. The aftermath of the Battle of Plassey in 1757 wrestled control of Bengal away from the local Nawab ruler and his French allies, leaving the British to become the leading military and political power in the region. This acted as a springboard for the British East India Company to expand its territory further in later years, either assuming direct rule themselves or via local rulers who were threatened with force from the company's private armies. Further conflicts of the 18th century, namely the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War in particular, gifted Britain even further territorial concessions at the expense of her rivals. In North America, the British captured Quebec in 1759. And effectively ended French colonial efforts on the continent with the annexation of New France by 1760. Florida passed into British control from Spain, leaving virtually the entire eastern seaboard of North America in British hands. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the 7 Years' War in 1763, also ceded the Caribbean islands of Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines, as well as Tobago, to Britain, which was now the most dominant colonial and maritime power of the age. Throughout its history, the British Empire would be powered by two components that went hand in hand with one another. Firstly, mastery of the high seas through naval supremacy, and secondly, indomitable mercantile trade that was free from foreign aggression. This exponential increase in trade gained immense wealth for Britain through the taxation of goods that passed through its ports. However, the issue of taxation itself would soon lead to revolution and the first major colonial loss for the empire. Although Britain considered its colonies to be sovereign territory, it did not afford them the same rights and privileges which were enjoyed on the British mainland. Throughout the 1760s and 1770s, relations between Britain and its 13 colonies in America became increasingly strained due to Parliament taxing the colonies without their consent or representation. Many within the 13 colonies considered this a breach of their rights as Englishmen and formally renounced the authority of Parliament in 1775, resulting in the outbreak of revolution. Britain sent troops to quell the rebelling colonists, but in the following year of 1776, the leading political figures of the colonies assembled to form the Second Continental Congress and declared their independence from Britain. After a protracted war of 8 years, Britain's military forces in the colonies were finally defeated, and the United States of America was recognized as an independent nation. The loss of America marked a sea change for the British Empire. After this, British colonial efforts shifted towards Asia, the Pacific, and Africa, where explorers had charted many new lands yet to be colonized by Europeans. One such explorer was Captain James Cook, who mapped and claimed much of the Pacific Ocean, including New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia, in the name of Britain. Although Cook was killed on the island of Hawaii during his third voyage, the discoveries he made during the 1770s would be instrumental to the further expansion of the empire. Australia was to serve as a penal settlement for British convicts, who would otherwise have been transported to the 13 colonies before they were lost. The first shipment of convicts arrived in the colony of New South Wales in 1788, and this practice of sentencing criminals to transportation continued into the middle of the 19th century. Britain also expanded its colonial interests into the North Pacific. Explorers such as George Vancouver and Alexander Mackenzie surveyed the western coast of North America in the 1790s, which subsequently opened up the territory to British mercantile interests, particularly that of the fur trade. Inroads were also made into the vast interior of the Rocky Mountains, which expanded British North America westwards. War with France in 1803 would once again challenge Britain's position as the dominant colonial power of the age, with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte in the aftermath of the French Revolution. To protect itself and its colonies from invasion, Britain invested large sums of capital and resources into the war effort, with the Royal Navy blockading French ports and attacking French overseas possessions. A crucial victory was won at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 against the combined Franco-Spanish Navy, albeit at the loss of Britain's Admiral Lord Nelson, who was killed in action. Victory at Trafalgar not only eliminated the threat of invasion for Britain, but it also secured the uncontested supremacy of the Royal Navy for the next 140 years. By the time the Napoleonic Wars had drawn to a close in 1815, the victorious Allied coalition, of which Britain was a part of, secured further territory from the defeated French, Spanish and Dutch, who had been part of Napoleon's French Empire. The Ionian Islands, Malta, Mauritius, St. Lucia, the Seychelles, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Ceylon and the Cape Colony were added to Britain's already substantial number of colonies. Many of these Caribbean colonies contained countless plantations dedicated to the production of sugarcane, which, over the centuries, had become exclusively reliant on slave labour. Although Britain had already profited tremendously from the transatlantic slave trade, the advent of the Industrial Revolution shifted the focus of merchants and capitalists to produce goods at home in Britain, rather than relying on slave-produced goods from the colonies. Additionally, growing political pressure from abolitionist groups eventually forced the hand of the British government to abolish the slave trade within the empire in 1807. It would be another 27 years, however, before the institution of slavery itself would be formally abolished in 1834. The period from 1815 to 1914 has often been described as Britain's imperial century. After effectively seizing control over the Indian subcontinent, the British East India Company looked to expand its interests further across Asia. Singapore was founded